The relationship between science, what we know about the disease, and what we do about the disease is indeed one of the most important and interesting aspects of it. In the past, with previous contagions, the scientific understanding was crucial in helping people decide how to fight it. So if you thought the cholera was contagious, you took certain precautions against it, like interrupting travel, like keeping the infected out and that sort of thing. But if you thought that cholera arose from filthy circumstances, then you didn't really care about travel, and you spent your efforts trying to clean up dirty cities instead. So the science dictated the form of prevention that you took. Now that kind of battle over scientific understandings of the disease has been much less so with COVID. There aren't really any fundamental scientific disagreements over why we have COVID, how it arises, how it's transmitted, and so forth. The science was the same all over the globe, broadly speaking, and yet the public health choices have been so different. So the science isn't sort of determining these choices in any obvious sense. Quite the contrary, what we see is that politicians are sort of deciding what they want to do, and then they're sort of selecting those aspects of the scientific explanation that support their conclusions. Now, we've already touched a bit on how this is the case in Sweden, but it was largely the case in every country. Science pointed in various directions. There were some things that everyone agreed on, like that it was a good thing to distance people from each other. It was a bad thing to go into crowded indoor arenas. But beyond that, there was an awful lot of dispute about both the science and what it meant in terms of public health terms. So, for example, whether or not you shut down travel was very much up in the air. The WHO at first gave conflicting advice. It sort of recommended against shutting down travel, and nations decided these issues very differently. Trump imposed travel bans on China, and then he imposed travel bans in Europe. New Zealand and Australia, completely shut down. The UK, broadly speaking, didn't impose nearly the same sorts of travel bans that were the case elsewhere for a long time. So in other words, a broad array of different responses, even though the science of shutting down is, broadly the same everywhere. Here was a clear case of where science didn't in any sense determine the outcome. Much the same can be said about the role of asymptomatic carriers. How important were those who didn't have symptoms but were infected in transmitting? It took a while for the science to figure out that with COVID, in fact, a large number, somewhere between a third and half, we don't know for sure, of all people who are infected have no symptoms but can still transmit. But once that became clear, it then became obvious that it was important to start testing these people because it was the only way of finding the asymptomatics. It also became clear that masks were actually more important than had been thought before, because asymptomatic, if they wore masks, would be less dangerous than if they otherwise were. So the role of asymptomatic carriers was something that was very important. The science finally pointed to the importance of that, but again, the politicians reacted very differently. The Swedes, up until very recently, absolutely denied the importance of asymptomatic transmission, which is what allowed them to not to discourage mask wearing, but to not necessarily recommend it. And we have the same thing when it comes to herd immunity. Science did not think that herd immunity was possible, or it realized that if it was possible, it could be achieved only by an enormous loss of life. And even then, even if the virus were to rip through the population, it was entirely unclear in the early phases whether there was any sort of immune response. And if there was an immune response, how long it lasted. And yet there were politicians who, despite this complete absence of any scientific knowledge about herd immunity, went for it anyway. The Tories did up until March in the UK, and the Swedes until just quite recently. Herd immunity was an idea that was favored by those who wanted to limit the lockdowns, who wanted to avoid the freezing of the economy that came with that. In other words, it was a political decision to go for herd immunity. It was not a scientific decision. It was a decision that was taken, if anything, against the science. So it's very hard to say that the science really did much to drive the public health response, or I guess it'd be more accurate to say that the public health response and the science sort of, proceeded independently of each other.